This is Manhattan Insights, a Manhattan Institute production. I'm your host, Raihan Salam. New Yorkers like to think of their city as the greatest in the world, but that attitude of New York exceptionalism has its downsides, especially if it means residents tolerate policies that, for example, push up the cost of housing to levels they wouldn't tolerate elsewhere. Eric Kober knows New York inside and out. A senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and an adjunct lecturer at the Yale School of Architecture, he worked at the New York City Department of City Planning for 38 years, retiring as the Director of Housing, Economic, and Infrastructure Planning in 2017. Today, he joins us to discuss the perils of New York exceptionalism and how, through better land use, its policymakers might make the city and state more welcoming places to live.
The key thing about planning is not that you have to allow unlimited growth everywhere, but you have to allow enough growth to house your labor force. Since cities, and I mean, this is, I'm quoting here Alain Bertone, who was a prominent urban planner, and cities are labor markets. That's fundamentally the reason you have cities. It's where people come together to work, and of course they have to live in some proximity to where they work, and the subways allow them to disperse across the consolidated city. And what happened was that going into the post-war city, the post-war period, the subways continued to expand and more six-story apartment buildings continued to be built.
Eric, in your latest issue brief for the Manhattan Institute, you point to a kind of ideological tendency in New York politics. You call it New York exceptionalism. Can you tell us what that means?
Well, New York exceptionalism is a variant on American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is an idea which is probably honored more in terms of being criticized than being supported at this point. But it's the idea that the United States is somehow special and it has a unique mission in the world at a sort of higher level of righteousness about perfection of its constitution and its institutions. And of course, there are many reasons why people might not quite buy into that at this point, but New York exceptionalism is saying much the same thing about New York, that in the United States, New York is unique, head and shoulders above all other cities. It's an amazing, exciting, vibrant place. It's got the best culture and the best architecture and the best restaurants and so on and so forth. And therefore, I could never think of, an advocate of New York exceptionalism would say, I could never think of anything else. And sure, the streets are dirty and, there are rats and piles of garbage, but I could never think of living anywhere else.
It's interesting because when I think of American exceptionalism, I think of it as a kind of ideological argument in part, but also just a recognition that the United States does have a distinctive history. You can celebrate that, you can lament it, but, I think it's a reasonable proposition. But with New York exceptionalism, it almost sounds as though what you're saying is that this is an argument that the city should not stoop to compete, that the city does not need to do the things that Indianapolis or Houston or Miami need to do. We are immune to the kind of gravitational force of competition. Is that a fair characterization in your view?
I think it's a little bit. I think that's a component of it. I think the sort of general view is that New York doesn't have to change at all because it has already achieved a certain level of perfection. But in particular, it is that, New York State has the highest taxes among all the states. New York City is the highest taxed place in the state. New York City has, in many ways, failing public services in exchange for its extremely high level of taxation. That the idea of New York exceptionalism is that none of that really matters because the city is just great. And so people won't leave, no matter how poorly the city is governed, no matter how unpleasant many aspects of living in New York City are. People just won't leave, and it'll continue to be great.
But of course, you've documented that is not quite true, that New York has experienced significant outmigration for decades, and that until recently this outmigration was being balanced by inward migration, but that's changing. Tell us more about that.
Well, the Census Bureau has quite a sizable, in its population estimates, quite a sizable outmigration since the 2020 census. I've argued that that's a little bit, it's probably directionally true, uh, but the magnitude of the outmigration is probably overstated in the
But Eric,
population
that's
estimate.
net outmigration. And my understanding is that outmigration has been a very big factor for decades, not just since 2020.
There's a tremendous churning in the population, which has always been true. That the suburbs of New York basically get populated by people who left the city. Usually, there's sort of a family life cycle for people with higher income that when they're younger, they live in the city, they get married, maybe they have their first child, and then they go out to the suburbs. And that's how the New York suburbs have always been populated. Uh, and in addition, there's obviously a tremendous amount of outmigration to other parts of the country. But New York has always had a very high level of in-migration. It's concentrated among young adults. There's really two categories of young adults. One is college-educated, native-born people who come to New York to sort of find their fortune and their mate, and then immigrants. In the 2010 to 2020 decade, the ratio was about two-thirds young native-born adults to one-third immigrants. That was a change from the 90s and the 2000s when it was about two-thirds immigrants and one-third native-born young adults.
And from a fiscal perspective, I gather when you're looking at that inflow of young, college-educated, unmarried adults, that was a pretty attractive inflow to have because, immigrant workers, they, of course, have been a huge boon for the city in many respects. But oftentimes, those are young families with children. There is more of a need for services, whether it's education or other services. Whereas when you're looking at those young, relatively affluent, educated singles, that looks like a pretty good deal from the city's fiscal perspective. Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. They use relatively few services and they spend a lot of money. And they support. They've really supported a very significant amount of real estate investment in places like northern Brooklyn and western Queens. In the last couple of decades.
But your sense is that something is changing. Is it that the inflow is no longer balancing out the outflow? Is it that the city is becoming marginally less attractive to those young singles? What is going on here?
Well, I think the world has become more competitive. That the New Yorkers used to, and probably in many cases still do, kind of sneer at other large American cities, really with the exception of, perhaps Boston and San Francisco, but certainly many other cities as being sort of unworthy of being, considered as competitors for New York's businesses and educated workers. And that is less and less the case. Many of the amenities that sort of cool neighborhoods, with lots of restaurants and sophisticated entertainment options that New York has always had, are much more widely found in other, sizable cities across the country. So New York City has a lot more competition than it used to have. In many of those places, rents are much lower, which is, of course, extremely important. And so that even if people are less well paid, professionals will be well paid in every city, even if they're less well paid, they end up with a better standard of living because they pay so much less for housing.
Talk to us about rents. That is something you've been thinking about for literally decades. It's an area where you were identifying really pronounced challenges well before many others were. But it's now become kind of a consensus that high rents are a huge, huge problem for New York City's future growth trajectory. But why is that necessarily a problem? I mean, one could argue that high rents are a sign of the city's vitality and attractiveness. What's the issue with high rents as you see them?
Well, the issue with high rents is that, and it's really a combination of high rents and limited supply. The problem is that it freezes out most of the people who want to live in New York City. If you have sort of tradable skills, as many people do, whether you're not a college grad, it's just a high school grad, you have skills that are valued in many cities, or could be valued in many cities, or you're a college grad and you have skills that could be valued in many cities. You will often greatly improve your standard of living by moving out of New York City or never moving to New York City at all, even though you can earn more, usually in New York City, because the economy is highly productive. And so what you end up with is what we have, which is sort of enclaves of glittering wealth, sort of increasingly stressed lower income areas where there isn't enough housing to meet the demand among people who want to take lower paying jobs and need relatively affordable housing. And then you have a handful of lucky people who win housing lotteries and get into publicly sponsored affordable housing. But that represents a tiny percentage of the population, and no one can make life plans based on the assumption that they're going to win a housing lottery. You're much better off moving to a cheaper city where housing is relatively available at affordable rents.
When did you see this problem first emerge? You were working for the Department of City Planning for almost 40 years. You saw the city bounce back from a quite dismal economic state. When did you start seeing this bizarre problem of the city being quite attractive and therefore creating this affordability problem?
Well, the problem, first manifested itself really in the 1980s when the city began to recover from the fiscal crisis. So this was sort of the economic upcycle in the mid-1980s, which ended with the stock market crash in 1987. And at that point, the city had lost enormous numbers of housing units. And as a result of housing abandonment in the 1970s. So it didn't really have a lot of, even though it had huge numbers of vacant buildings, it had lots of vacant land, didn't have a lot of rentable units.
Those units were just uninhabitable, essentially.
Yeah, they were uninhabitable.
Yeah.
And that was, Mayor Koch in that period instituted really the first post-fiscal crisis housing plan, the core of which was that the city owned tens of thousands of vacant buildings and undertook to rehabilitate those buildings and bring them back into the housing stock. And that was actually done successfully. It sort of the program of rehabilitating those buildings overlapped into the subsequent mayoralty of Rudolph Giuliani, but it was finished by Giuliani's second term. And that brought a very substantial number of units back online, which were sold to private landlords and rented out, in many cases, to immigrants, since immigrants were flooding into the city at that point. And that was a very successful program because there wasn't an effort to maintain sort of perpetual stranglehold on, who could live in those units, other than through by subjecting the units to rent stabilization. But rent stabilization was more generous in that period than it is now. So that was a very successful program. At the same time, Koch directed the Department of City Planning to start reforming the very restrictive zoning resolution that was passed in 1961. And so the City Planning Commission began a series of liberalizing housing reforms, which began to allow more density in various parts of the city. And those reforms didn't really pay off until the latter half of the Giuliani administration, because the city's economy just wasn't strong enough.
I just want to back up there for a moment, Eric. So, when you're looking at New York City in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, this was a city that was exploding. It was experiencing just really dramatic growth, the kind of growth that these days you see in South Asia, Africa, that is, virtually unheard of when you're looking at the more mature market democracies. I grew up in Brooklyn, which, at the time the city was consolidated in 1898, a lot of it was still farmland. By the time you get to the teens and 20s, you had entire neighborhoods that were getting built, single-family homes, but also quite substantial apartment buildings. What is it that changed? You mentioned the 1961 zoning law, but I just wonder, because there really was a time when, speculators during boom times were just throwing up huge amounts of housing. You had subways, carving through the boroughs, left and right. What happened in mid-century New York?
Well, what happened in mid-century New York were several things. I mean, first of all, the pattern that started at, if you go back to the early 1900s, there were three sort of epical events that caused the growth of the city to explode. One was called the dual contracts, which were contracts that were signed by the city in 1913 with two subway operating companies to operate a subway system that the city would build with its own resources. And so that was the period in which the subways were basically constructed out into farmland. Speculative builders sort of followed the course of the subway and built really six-story apartment buildings, which blanketed the city. And why 6 stories? It was the tallest building you could build without being fully fireproof. So the sort of ubiquitous 6-story apartment building with fire escapes proliferated across the city. So the third very important law was called the New Tenement Law, which was enacted in 1901, and it set minimum quality standards for these 6-story apartment buildings. So they were much improved as living environments in comparison to the older tenements that were built in the late 1800s. These were, 3 extremely benign developments that resulted in the explosive growth of the city. The city also enacted zoning in 1916, but the zoning was actually very permissive. And the real limitation on what got built was not the zoning, but the new tenement law, which specified that you had to be fully fireproof if you were taller than 6 stories.
So that was de-densifying to some degree, because when you're looking at the Lower East Side, the tenements of that era, I mean, these were very, very dense and they were very crowded living conditions. But, what you're saying is that, the 6-story buildings, they were somewhat less dense, but it wasn't all that restrictive. And it was, primarily a set of safety regulations rather than a deliberate effort to reduce housing supply.
Yeah. I mean, they were dense enough to accommodate the population growth. I mean, the key thing about planning is not that you have to allow unlimited growth everywhere, but you have to allow enough growth to house your labor force. Since cities, and I mean, I'm quoting here Alain Bertone, who was a prominent urban planner, and cities are labor markets. That's fundamentally the reason you have cities. It's where people come together to work, and of course they have to live in some proximity to where they work. And the subways allow them to disperse across the consolidated city. And what happened was that going into the post-war city, the post-war period, the subways continued to expand, and more 6-story apartment buildings continued to be built. The big move post-war was part of it was built just before the war, but is the construction of the Queens Boulevard subway in Queens, which really opened up central Queens to the construction of apartment buildings. And that mostly took place in the post-war period, and that was the sort of last big push.
And it seems like it was successful overall when you're thinking about the kind of insalubrious conditions of the 19th century tenement. These were huge improvements. These were places where many middle-income families really wanted to live. You were opening up these big frontiers. So then why the backlash? Particularly because you'd assume that in the Depression era, there were a lot of people who why would they be opposed to the idea of further growth along the lines of these, kind of garden apartments, these developments that really were seen as much more attractive?
Well, planners lost their minds really in this period, and the sort of proximate cause of them losing their minds was I think, twofold. One was the deterioration of the older parts of the city, which was quite visible. Remember that in 1960, the Bronx was known as the borough without a slum, and Manhattan was the borough of slums. And there was very sort of marked deterioration in the
sort of sharks and jets battling each other on the west side, that kind of thing.
That was quite fictional, but the fact that the neighborhood was run down was true.
Yeah.
The two things. One was the sort of visible deterioration of the older parts of the city, and the other was the advent of the motor car, which there was a very, very rapid run-up in car ownership in the 1950s, and it turned out that it sort of leveled off after 1960, but people in the 1950s didn't know that was going to happen, so they really thought they had to adapt the city, and every city thought they had to adapt their city to the advent of the motor car. And
So Eric, just to clarify on that, so basically this was also the era in parallel when you saw the suburbs, just expanding by leaps and bounds, growing enormously. So what you're suggesting is that in that post-war moment, there were some people who feared that if the city itself did not become more auto-friendly, more suburban, then it would further lose population. Is that it?
They thought that the middle class would desert the city. They were looking at the deterioration of Manhattan. They thought the middle class would desert the city, and the city would be city of the poor, and the middle class would live in the suburbs. And so the solution to this, among many other solutions, obviously there was a mass highway building. In order to make the city more car friendly. A lot of roads got stopped ultimately that were originally planned, but a good number got built. There was mass urban renewal, which was designed to take places like the West Side, where the original West Side Story movie was filmed in the Lincoln Square urban renewal area, and there was urban renewal was designed to build housing that was suited to the middle class, and the idea of housing that was suited to the middle class was a high rise surrounded by copious amounts of open space. So the model was Stuyvesant Town, which was completed in 1948, and really had beautiful open spaces, parks and playgrounds. It was thought to be a place suitable for the middle class, and that was the model. And that was a model that greatly reduced urban densities even from the 6-story apartment buildings. And so
So the 1961 zoning law attempted to entrench that Stuyvesant Town, Tower and a Plaza ideal for the city as a whole.
It did, and it tried to freeze the city where those buildings were not being constructed. Now, those buildings were Stuyvesant Town was really the original urban renewal project, and it was done under a state program because this was before the federal urban renewal program was enacted. But many subsequent Tower in the Park type developments were built around the city using federal urban renewal funding, and the zoning really sought to freeze the city where that wasn't happening.
So in a sense, this was an expression of pessimism about the prospect that at some point in the future, people would once again want to live in a dense, walkable city. It was almost a defensive maneuver where you're saying that, okay, if people are going to want to live in the suburbs, that's the kind of life they're going to want. We're not going to grow to become a city of 10 million or 15 million. That's not going to happen. So let's consolidate and at least not be a city of slums.
Right. And then Jane Jacobs was writing, unbeknownst to the people who were drafting this 1961 zoning resolution. Jane Jacobs was writing her classic book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and it was a polemic against urban renewal and everything that the 1961 zoning was trying to accomplish, and sort of a tribute to the life in the street and the sort of the way in which different kinds of activities could mix in urban neighborhoods and sort of feed off one another. And these were all anathema to the planners in the period. So
kind of celebration of that New York that existed somewhere between the 1916 zoning law and the 1961 zoning law.
Right. It was a celebration of her neighborhood, which was the West Village, and sort of a denunciation of the urban renewal plans that existed at that time for that neighborhood, ultimately Jane Jacobs won this fight. People were persuaded that everything that they had been trying to do was anti-urban. But we had this zoning, and we've had it ever since, and it's been sort of like an ever uphill battle to build housing against a pattern in which most people's neighborhoods are zoned so that they'll never change again.
And so basically, through the 60s and the 70s, the zoning law was bad. It entrenched a certain urban form, but in a way it wasn't all that relevant because the city was still hemorrhaging middle-income families. There wasn't necessarily a huge amount of appetite to build on a large scale. But as you say, mid-80s, you get a meaningful economic recovery, and suddenly you're bumping up against these limits.
Yeah, and that's really when this sort of uphill struggle began, which began in the Koch administration and continued really through the Bloomberg administration to try to sort of push against those limits and get more housing built through a series of zoning changes, some of which were quite successful, and you can see the results in places like Long Island City and Greenpoint Williamsburg and the west side of Manhattan, that very substantial amounts of housing were built in specific areas. But most of the city was frozen and has hardly changed at all. And if you look at historic photographs of most neighborhoods in the city, and there are, the city took tax photos in the 1930s and 1940s. So there's a sort of historical Google Street Views of different neighborhoods, and many neighborhoods look about the same. They just haven't changed that much, and
many of the neighborhoods that are the most beloved in New York City, you talk about Jane Jacobs West Village, but many neighborhoods in every borough, the built environment that is so prized, those buildings literally could not be built today under the post-1961 zoning regime.
They couldn't be built today, and they can't be replaced. I mean, again, the key thing in planning is not that you can't have historic districts and you can't preserve some, of your most beloved neighborhoods, but you have to have enough capacity to offset that and house your labor force. And that is something that New York City has found it extraordinarily difficult to do, and has sort of dismally failed, in particular, to pursue really, in the post-Bloomberg years.
Eric, you've documented that between 2008 and 2019, the New York metropolitan area created 2.31 jobs for every new unit of housing. How does that even work? I mean, that just seems so extraordinary that, part of it could be overcrowding. Certainly when you're looking at a lot of working class immigrants, a big challenge we have in New York City is that you have illegal basement dwelling units, oftentimes quite unsafe, but you have people, living there in large numbers. You see people carving up studios, one-bedroom apartments, living in very intensely crowded conditions. And then for more affluent people, you have many people who might prefer not to live with roommates, but who do. But I'm curious, talk to me about how people have accommodated this imbalance between job creation and the creation of new housing units. Part of it, I guess, is that some regions have actually built housing, but I'm curious.
The city has added about 200,000 units a decade, so it doesn't add zero housing, but the city has about 3.6 million housing units, and that it's just not enough.
Does that even balance out the depreciation? Does that even balance out the fact that some housing units get so decrepit and old that they eventually become hard to live in?
Yeah, that's the net gain. That's from census to census. So the census counts habitable housing units at each decennial census, and so that the net gain is about 200,000 a decade. So it's not zero, but it's not enough. And it's not what other big cities are doing, that have done a much better job.
So if we were at 2.31 to 1, tell us about some other cities. What does that balance look like in some other
in other cities, I don't have the numbers on the top of my head, but other numbers have done much better. And for example, the D.C. metropolitan area, which is a relatively expensive place, has done much better in terms of building housing relative to jobs. Seattle has done much better. Of course, the Sunbelt cities, Houston and Charlotte and Atlanta, have done phenomenally better. A lot of cities do it by sprawl, right? You have, sort of parts of the country where metropolitan areas have no natural barriers to growth, and they do it by sprawl. But some places have done it by densification. Certainly, that's true in D.C. and Seattle, where the cities have gained a significant amount of population without expanding, their geographic boundaries.
And you don't even have to go to the Sun Belt. If you just go to northern New Jersey, you've often remarked on the fact that had it not been for New Jersey's willingness to embrace growth, at least in relative terms, the region would be in much worse shape.
Yeah, New Jersey's growth per capita is about double the cities. And northern New Jersey's growth per capita, and that has obviously been very significant. And they have evolved a sort of pro-housing political system in which municipalities are very much dependent on their own tax resources for services, and that encourages them to allow growth in order to improve their tax base.
Interesting, because I suppose one scenario is that, you see this in certain suburban jurisdictions. They'll say, we don't want to build housing because on a, kind of from a fiscal perspective, they're very concerned about whether or not people will represent a kind of net benefit or a net drain. But they will, in many cases, embrace office development because, okay, well, that will bring in tax revenue of one kind, or maybe it'll be retail sales tax revenue, something like that. But why is it that New Jersey made the bet that, hey, this is going to be a fiscal boon to embrace growth and not just at the high end, whereas New York State has not decided to take that deal?
Well, New Jersey, I think that the situation, if you go back a couple of decades, is that there were very high vacancy rates in suburban office parks in New Jersey, and it just wasn't a viable route to growth. Residential was the route that they had. I think that in New York you have a couple of things. One is that Um, you 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 see something very similar in the cities in Westchester. If you look at the four largest cities of Westchester, Yonkers, New Rochelle, Mount Vernon, and White Plains, they have been pro housing growth. Uh, for much the same reason that Jersey City and Bayonne and those similar places in New Jersey have been pro housing growth. They need the taxes, and they already have poor people that they have to provide services to. Uh, the suburban, the sort of single family jurisdictions in New Jersey have been more resistant to growth. And obviously, the single family jurisdictions on the New York side, which particularly on Long Island, are most of the land area in Nassau and Suffolk counties have been extremely resistant to growth because they already have very high incomes, and people have paid a premium to buy a house, and they got into a lot of debt, and they don't want anything to change that might devalue their house or cause their taxes to go up.
So there's a certain risk aversion. If I'm Jersey City, if I'm White Plains, as you were saying, it could be that you have a depressed downtown, already very low income population. So, you shake the kaleidoscope and maybe things will get better. Whereas these are all communities that fear that any change, any population expansion is going to diminish what makes them, attractive, bucolic, and also overwhelmingly high income.
Right. And we have a history here in which, some of the oldest suburbs in the United States are in, the New York suburbs. New York pioneered the building of parkways in Westchester and on Long Island, which opened up the farmland really even before the Second World War. In other parts of the country, suburbs tend to be newer. But they opened up rather earlier than most parts of the country, and so the land use pattern is extremely well established.
But you'd think that wouldn't apply to New York City, because New York City, while not depressed in the way of these cities in New Jersey and in Westchester you've described, it is a city that certainly has long had a large low-income working-class population. So, New York City isn't Scarsdale, certainly when it comes to scale and when it comes to openness. But why is that New York City has the land use politics of Scarsdale? I mean, that's an exaggeration.
Because it was always able to tax core central business district real estate for most of its revenue. And of course, that's changed. And so there was this idea during the Blasio administration. There was a huge economic boom. The city gained enormous numbers of jobs, hundreds of thousands of jobs. And a big chunk of that was spent on dramatically increasing the city's spending on affordable housing. And there was this idea that, because the underlying economy was so strong, we would just redistribute the income and we didn't need any of this private real estate growth that Bloomberg, had encouraged. We would just do it with public money, and it would all be "quote unquote" affordable, which is to say, available at rents below the market. And that's kind of where we are. We're in a situation where we have made ourselves extremely dependent on public funding, but we
based on an economic model that might no longer be there.
Based on an economic model that might not be there. We also created an extremely expensive tax abatement program in which new residential buildings that included a certain percentage of their units as affordable housing were granted a tax exemption for 35 years. And really taking away, so that not only was New York City not dependent the way, say, Jersey City is on residential real estate for its property tax revenues, but we gave all the revenue away for
I want to
decades.
go back for a moment. So you mentioned the Bloomberg era and what was happening then. So, you were talking earlier on about the mid-'80s economic recovery. You suddenly start to see this problem and this imbalance because the city was becoming attractive again, both to immigrants but also to these college-educated workers. Okay, then you have the Giuliani years. That trend is continuing. You have somewhat better land use policies here or there on an ad hoc basis. But, it's imperfect. And fundamentally, the 1961 pattern is still what dominates. That's still the status quo. You get to the Bloomberg era, and this is an era that is very polarizing. I would argue that there's a lot of myth-making around it. But the perception from some opponents of land use reform is that the Bloomberg era was an era when there were massive giveaways to real estate, cranes everywhere, massive housing construction, and that was an example of what happens when there's this free-for-all. And all that happens is that you're only building luxury housing, and then gentrification becomes the scourge. And it seems like then you get this kind of intense anti-development backlash. There was always anti-development sentiment, but it seems as though in the Bloomberg era, bleeding into the de Blasio era, that's when anti-development almost became the heartbeat of the urban left. So talk to us about what actually happened in the Bloomberg era as you understand it.
Well, what happened in the Bloomberg era is, clearly that city had a tremendous amount of economic growth. And as a consequence of that, it transitioned from a situation in which I think the city council perceived growth as being vital, right? There was a lot of talk after 9/11 that the cities had no future, that people were going to leave, or people who had the resources to leave were going to leave. And this is the same fear that is a recurring fear that we will be left with a city of the poor, as many other cities have been left as cities of the poor. And so growth was, a sign of business confidence in the city, and that was good. There actually was not all that much growth. There is myth-making involved here, but most neighborhoods hardly changed at all. There was a substantial amount of restriction in terms of zoning, and that was part of the political horse trading that Bloomberg's...
The growth was really happening in these industrial zones, right? On the fringe of the city rather than across the city.
Well, they were industrial zones. They were not necessarily on the fringe of the city. That one of the sort of amazing things about the 1961 zoning is that they mapped industrial zones in extremely centrally located parts of the city, and
I should say by fringe, I mean when you're looking at the waterfront, when you're looking at the North Brooklyn waterfront areas that certainly are centrally located, but rather they weren't in the heart of the kind of established neighborhoods.
No, they weren't in the heart of the established neighborhoods, but they were extremely well located in terms of transit accessibility, and the L train became the sort of hippest train in the universe, but there was a time when hardly anybody rode it. And, and that was a tremendous, that it was a tremendous opportunity that was lying there to be seized, that we could build a lot of housing in the route of the L train. And we already had a subway line, a very underutilized subway line that those residents could have access to.
And it was a bit of a political dodge because rather than taking on the heart of the 1961 zoning law, what you're saying is that, okay, well, this is not going to be especially controversial if we build here on the waterfront. Otherwise, it's derelict industrial property or something like that. We're not actually taking on the fight within the neighborhood from locals who do not want to see their neighborhood change.
Yeah, well, it was certainly controversial, but the deal was doable, and it got done. Similarly, Long Island City was another industrial area on the waterfront, and that there were actually multiple deals in Long Island City, but they got done as well. And the west side of Manhattan, the High Line District and Hudson Yards to the north, those deals got done. And those were all industrial areas that were very well located relative to the transit system. And, in fact, in Hudson Yards, the Bloomberg administration extended the subway, number 7 subway, for one stop in order to improve its accessibility. So, those were great opportunities that were seized successfully, but they were seized successfully because there was a consensus between the mayor and the city council that post 9/11, the city had to come back, and these growth opportunities were the way to bring it back.
And then by the time you get to de Blasio, essentially the city is taking growth for granted and actually treating growth as a nuisance, actually treating growth more as a problem than as an urgent necessity.
Yeah, I think that there were, the economy was stronger, and I'd like to point out that de Blasio was really the first mayor probably since Jimmy Walker in 1925 who took office and wasn't in the midst of a fiscal crisis. The city was booming in the 1920s, and again, it was booming in the 2010s when de Blasio took office. And in between, it was mostly not booming. And, there were continually these fiscal crunches in which the consensus was that growth was the way out of those fiscal crunches. So, once the city's economy became stable and predictable, it created a sort of opening for anti-development politics, which had been sort of less welcome in the past.
Which has managed to have a really tenacious hold. So, okay, let's fast forward to the development politics of our current moment. So in recent decades, we've seen an average of about 200,000 net new housing units created in New York City. Enter Mayor Adams. Mayor Adams, he's coming to office in a different, more anxious climate. This is coming off of the COVID pandemic, this rising sense that urban cores are facing new threats, to their attractiveness, to the desirability of this kind of brand of urban living. Big change from the de Blasio era, from the heart of the de Blasio era. And he's saying, I want to build 500,000 units over the next decade. It seems as though he is someone who is genuinely, enthusiastically pro-development in a way that hasn't been true. And as a player in city politics, he was someone who, overall generally did have at least a bit of a lean towards a more transactional political style that was at least open to the idea that real estate development could be a good thing. Tell me how that's been shaking out.
Well, the way it's been shaking out is I think that the Adams administration is caught in a web of contradictions that it has been unable to resolve. And the mayor's housing advisor, Jessica Katz, just resigned. A new deputy mayor, the current deputy mayor for economic development, was given the housing portfolio as well. The contradictions are that the administration thinks of itself as being progressive. It wants to promote housing equity and build lots of affordable housing. But on the other hand, it's experiencing a fiscal crunch, which was very familiar to all the mayors prior to de Blasio. And the way you manage a fiscal crunch, if you do it properly, and you don't want to get into a 1975 style fiscal crisis, is twofold. One is that you scale back on hiring, which Adams has been doing, and you scale back on capital spending. You try not to spend money on things that you don't have to spend money on. You have to fix the bridges, but you don't have to build affordable housing. That's a choice. And so it's very hard to be both progressive and fiscally conservative. Uh, uh, However, the fiscal conservatism is kind of forced upon him by the circumstances that we talked about earlier, which is that the office-based sort of property tax, sort of cornucopia is impaired.
Eric, just to spell this out, so housing under these stringent regulations, with the regulation saying that you have to set aside a certain number of below market rate units, you basically have to subsidize it. But the pie of subsidies available, that's going to depend on the larger economic climate, and we're just in a spot where we just don't have a lot of that. Now, one answer to that would be to say, well, why don't we relax those regulations and say that we are not going to be bitterly opposed to people building housing on their own dime, not on the city's dime? That seems like a pretty logical way out of this dilemma. I'm curious, is your view that market conditions are such, larger economic conditions are such that you would not see a ton of private real estate development if you just said the city, just said, hey, we're going to get out of the way, we're going to embrace growth, we need it to stabilize our tax base, it's not going to be subsidized, and let's see what happens? Or is your view that that actually would make a difference?
That would certainly make a difference, and I've sort of advocated for that in my writing. The sort of indication of the fact that we have continually, and this has been widely reported in the media, achieved record rents in Manhattan and some of the other areas where real estate brokerages track rents, like Northern Brooklyn and Long Island City. Many months in the last couple of years, they've reported that rents are at a record. That is a signal from the marketplace that housing supply is inadequate. And, when other goods began to rise in price, eggs rose in price, there weren't enough eggs. The solution to the egg problem was not to have affordable eggs, but to permit egg producers to expand the supply to meet the demand for eggs. And so it is with most things, and so it is with housing. And the idea that housing is different and needs to be heavily regulated by the government, and then the shortages that are caused by heavy government regulation need to be solved with heavy subsidies by the government. Those are just unsound ideas which have had disastrous results in New York City. Even if you regard yourself as being a sort of pro-housing equity, we've achieved a situation, as I mentioned earlier, in which a young adult who has marketable skills, skills that would enable that individual to get a job in any city, is which is a way to describe many young adults who graduate from high school or graduate from local colleges, and they are much better off just moving to one of those cities that is more open to housing. And that's just certainly bad for equity, and it's bad for New York City because it makes us into a kind of city that we don't really want to be.
But inclusionary housing rules, essentially what they're doing is they're imposing a tax on those people who are seeking to develop. It's not a tax on all businesses, but it's only on those who are actually, have the temerity to want to develop new housing.
Right, and the idea was that would be offset with this 35-year tax abatement through a program which was called 421A. But that expired in 2022, and the state legislature has not seen fit to renew it, and they've also refused the governor's request that they extend the deadline for completing buildings, which is now 2026, and that they extend it for another 4 years, because in the high interest rate environment that we have now, many buildings are just not going to be completed, even though they were grandfathered in 2022. So
New York City can't do this alone. New York City needs New York State to step in and pass some kind of legislation that's going to make it possible for building to get underway in New York. Is that your view?
Under the circumstances that they have, which again is that housing has to be heavily regulated by government. Part of that is that they need to require that a percentage of the units in each building be below market, and that they then need to compensate real estate developers through this tax mechanism, which doesn't actually exist at the moment.
So for pure market rate housing, you wouldn't need 421A. You could just go ahead and...
You wouldn't need it for condominiums. Condominiums are more favorably taxed. For large rental buildings, in fact, you don't necessarily need the 35-year abatement, but you need some kind of equalization mechanism because large rental buildings, which is to say more than 10 units, are taxed at about double the rate that co-ops and condos are taxed, and that small rental buildings are taxed. But if New York City did something which, as I've pointed out in my last brief, was just enacted in Washington State, which permits up to 4 units on any residentially zoned lot in the state, and up to 6 units on a residentially zoned lot that's within a quarter mile of transit, then those units, which could be rental buildings, would not be subject to this unfavorable tax regime that larger residential buildings are subject to.
Eric, talk to us about the politics of land use at the state level. Governor Kathy Hochul did recently advance a very big, ambitious, comprehensive proposal for overhauling land use in New York State that would have had pretty big effects on New York City, but also on New York City's suburbs. And that pretty much vanished without a trace. It was completely stripped out of the recent budget negotiations. It crashed and burned. I can say that you predicted that would happen early on, and it pretty much played out exactly as you thought it would. Talk to us a little bit about Governor Hochul's comprehensive housing reform push and why it met the fate it did.
It had no proponents, which, was bad. It had many opponents. And the governor did not have a political strategy to pass it. And that became extremely apparent, in terms of its fate in the legislature. So who were the opponents? Well, first of all, suburban legislators were pretty much uniformly opposed. The suburbs like local control, which, as we've discussed, it keeps house prices high, and it keeps while school taxes are high in the suburbs, they go to educating the children of relatively affluent people, which gets you very high quality schools, and not educating the children of the poor. So there was a lot of opposition among suburban legislators, both Democratic and Republican, but there was also opposition among Manhattan legislators because some of the changes that Hochul was proposing would have allowed more growth in Manhattan, which gets very little growth at this point because much of the borough of Manhattan is encumbered by historic districts, and most of the rest has just very restrictive zoning. I mean, even though it's dense, the zoning is kind of shrink-wrapped around the buildings that currently exist. So there are few opportunities for new buildings. And so a number of Manhattan legislators kind of like it that way, and they're concerned that if they allowed more growth in Manhattan, that the development opponents in Manhattan, who are extremely well organized, would back a challenger in the Democratic primary, which is really where elections take place. And in a low turnout Democratic primary, a well-organized interest group can be successful in terms of a primary challenge. So there were very significant opponents, and uh, really not, there was some pro-housing groups, but they didn't really have a lot of voters behind them. And so we ended up really with a complete loss.
It seems like there's this perverse dynamic where the New York City lawmakers are saying, hey, there ought to be more housing development in the suburbs. And then the suburban lawmakers say, well, there should be more housing development in the city. But, basically, there's no one who's willing to actually embrace it, a la some of those communities in Westchester and New Jersey that you mentioned before. These are cities that actually really embrace growth, that really welcome it. You just didn't see that in downstate New York.
You didn't see that, and I think that fiscal stringency is the thing that most encourages a pro-growth orientation among local governments. The suburban villages and towns are unlikely to experience, given how affluent they are, they're really unlikely to experience fiscal stringency. So the only way that changes is at the state level. So then the question is, well, is the state going to experience a fiscal crisis as a consequence of restrictive zoning, particularly in the downstate region, which produces most of the state's tax revenue? And the answer is it hasn't yet. There was, after I produced my latest brief, we saw some very up-to-date information about state income tax collections, which is the largest source of revenue at the state level. And income tax collections appear to be declining in relation to the growth of federal tax collections, and indicating that there may be something uniquely going on in New York State, that data hasn't been more closely analyzed. It may be that work from home is having an effect because commuters who stay home are not paying income taxes to New York State. It may be that some number of relatively affluent taxpayers are leaving the state as a result of high taxes, poor services, all the reasons why people might be inclined to leave the state. But we just don't know enough about at this point to answer the question of why tax revenues are declining. But if the state does experience a financial crisis, then it's going to have to think about ways to keep people in the state. And one way to get people in the state is to grow the population, to allow the population to grow in the places where there are jobs and where, the rental signals in the marketplace indicate that more housing is needed.
Eric, I want to suggest two potential bargains for resetting land use politics in New York State. The first, let's call this the progressive left bargain. That bargain is we will accept some land use reform in exchange for good cause eviction, essentially making rent regulation much more stringent, much more comprehensive in the state. The other bargain is the let's leave the suburbs out of it bargain. And that bargain would say, okay, we are not going to impose new, more aggressive housing targets in these suburbs that have really embraced a more exclusionary approach. And we're going to do something that really focuses narrowly on the 5 boroughs of New York City. Let's say we will do something on 421A. Let's say we will do some other kind of tax reform that's targeted on the urban core. I'm curious what you think about those two bargains. The good cause bargain is one that has been advanced by a lot of housing reformers on the left in New York. The argument is that, hey, this is the way that you can get progressives on board. They've really changed their minds. They're not really NIMBYs at all, but they really want to make sure that they get something for renters in the city.
Yeah, I mean, it turned out not to have much attraction in the state legislature. The progressive bargain turned out not to have much attraction in the state legislature. I think those people really don't want change. I mean, that's really what the politicians are responding to. There is not some, there's an ideological groundswell of support for good cause eviction, but there is not a popular groundswell of support for good cause eviction. It's not something that a Democratic legislator in the suburbs is going to fend off a primary challenge or a general election challenge from a Republican, because those are the only parts of the city where Republicans are contenders. They're not going to do, but I got you good cause eviction. It's not going to really help very much, because most
Just
people,
a brief note on that.
Yeah.
I also get the impression that good cause eviction could cause some pretty serious problems for the housing market in New York State, but I'm curious if you have a view on that.
It really depends. There are versions of good cause eviction which are sort of not that restrictive in terms of rent regulation, and there are other versions that are quite restrictive in terms of rent regulation. And so a lot depends on, what the bargain is, and but the legislature really didn't get that far to strike a bargain. The other version, the New York City only version, most people believe, I think, that some version of 421A will happen eventually. If you think of I like to liken the New York State legislature to, a pair of scales, right? So the campaign contributions get piled on one side, and it sort of lifts the legislature up to the point where they're willing to legislate. And, we're not there yet, but most people think that the way the system works, eventually there will be another version of 421A once enough campaign contributions get collected from the real estate industry. It may yet happen. The problem is that the city is, I think, mistaken in making itself dependent on getting these favors from the state legislature, which come with conditions, and the conditions may or may not be workable, and really needs to think about try to solve its housing crisis by just allowing people to build housing. And as I said, we had this sort of crazy system before 1961 where when there was a housing shortage, the city just extended the subway someplace, and speculative builders built 6-story apartment buildings up and down the subway line, and that worked.
So what you're saying is that New York City could unilaterally make a very big difference. Mayor Adams' goal of 500,000 units over the next 10 years, that's actually a goal that Washington, D.C. and Seattle have surpassed, over the last decade. So that's not some kind of crazy pie-in-the-sky idea. But I'm curious, you've laid out some ideas for Mayor Adams, ideas that he could pursue unilaterally without approval of the state legislature. And I'm curious, how far do you think those ideas could get us? And can he unilaterally relax some of those de Blasio era inclusionary housing rules in order to get there?
The City Planning Commission, with the approval of the City Council, absolutely can relax those rules. I mean, what was enacted through the land use change process can be repealed through the same process.
But is it politically possible?
Well, obviously it isn't politically possible, but everything is politically impossible until it becomes possible. And I think that, again, we're being sort of symbolically progressive in New York City at this point, and sort of effectively very unprogressive. In that, again, we have this great mechanism for social mobility for example, in the CUNY system, and but the typical CUNY grad, unless they're going into finance, is much better off taking their degree and moving somewhere else. It's really not what we want, The answer is that the case has to be made. The data have to be sort of examined as to, you know, what the system that we've evolved in which we overregulate and then we oversubsidize to compensate for the overregulation. We have to actually look at how that system works and, how irrational it really is and expensive to boot. And, don't we really want our young adults to have a future in New York City? It's as simple as that.
I take it you don't believe that adopting the social housing model pioneered by Red Vienna in the 19-teens is the solution.
Well, it involves the city spending a great deal more money that it doesn't have and isn't going to have. And so the New York City is bound by state law to balance its budget under generally accepted accounting principles. It's a post-fiscal crisis reform, and it has prevented a repetition of the fiscal crisis. But it does mean that when the economy is not pumping out tax revenue the way it did in the last decade, that the city has to be practicing budget austerity and not, budget growth or the taking on of vast new obligations.
Eric, let's say that the tax revenues aren't up to snuff, the COVID relief peters out, and Albany and City Hall are facing a pretty serious fiscal crunch. Tell us the message you'd want the mayor, the governor, to advance in order to make the case for housing growth. Something, kind of short, clear, straightforward. What would you be arguing to the public?
What I'd be arguing to the public is that we should be adding as many jobs as we can. We should be adding as much population as we need to add in order to fill those jobs. We should be, have a housing regulatory system that produces the number of housing units that population needs, to live decently. And if we do that, we will grow our way out of the fiscal crunch that we have now. If we're only going to have half the space standard in terms of, office space per employee, then we need twice as many employees to fill the office space that we have. If we only have 70% of the subway ridership that we have, and we want to maintain the fiscal stability of our transit system, we need a lot more workers so that there are more people riding the subway. So, that their growth actually is a virtuous cycle. All the other options involve austerity, which everybody hates. And, it will make everybody's lives worse. And we can't just keep raising taxes because that will drive away people and businesses. And we're going to get into a downward spiral of, increasing taxes and a declining revenue base, which we won't like.
You were working for the city during some incredibly bleak times. And you also presided over, and you yourself were a pretty important part of the city's revival from that moment. When you're looking at the state of land use politics, when you're looking at the fiscal and economic challenges facing the city, is your sense that, things have been worse before and actually you do see a path forward? Or do you think that this is just a uniquely challenging moment and you're not entirely sure if we have the leadership it's going to take to get out of it?
Well, the city was flat on its back in 1975. It was infinitely worse than what we have now. And the city was poor also. So what happened was that people got together and they said, well, we have to grow our way out of this. We can't imagine. The city now has just under 4 million private jobs. In 1977, it had 2.7 million private jobs. That people who were not there can't imagine, how bad it was. And then people got together and said, we have to grow our way out of this. It's the only way to solve this problem. We can't spend our way out of this with public money because we don't have any. And they came to enough of a consensus that they did grow their way out. So, I think that everybody was just as progressive in 1977 or 1980, and I and lots of other people made the argument that we can have as large a welfare state as we want to have. We have to have a tax base that can pay for it, and so first we have to grow, and then we can redistribute. But we can't redistribute before we grow, and it's we're in a much better place today, relatively speaking. But it's still true that we can't redistribute until we grow. And the sort of missing component, the thing that everybody's forgotten, is the growth part at this point, and they have to, rediscover it.
Eric, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Listeners, don't forget to check out his work for the Manhattan Institute. We'll link to a scholar page in the podcast description. If you like what you heard on the podcast, please feel free to write a review wherever you listen, and be sure to tune in to future episodes of Manhattan Insights. I'm your host, Raihan Salam.